If you blinked, you missed it. I think we hit as low as $4,100. If you're in Europe, you might have seen it. Gold and silver down 10% at one point, recovering now. What are we at? Here we are, $4,408.30 per ounce on gold on the CNBC COMEX futures. Silver below $70 at $69.50 per ounce. I mean, recovering amazingly. And as it says here on CNBC, gold sinks deeper into bear market territory as sell-off extends. Spot gold has now lost 22% since hitting a high of $5,594 at the end of January. So gold selling off, interestingly, during this war in Iran. I mean, it's quite interesting in the sense that, generally speaking, when we see a war begin, we do see a jump in gold, but perhaps this time around, gold had taken off so much. You almost wonder if it's a buy the rumor, sell the news. Perhaps there was a sense that people could see some sort of conflict coming, so it almost preempted a more traditional move. Hard to say, all speculation here. So hello and welcome to the Northern Miner Podcast. My name's Adrian Pocobelli. It continues, feeling a lot better this week. Again, hadn't had a flu for quite a while. So let's take a look. Aluminum front and center. Once again, as far as the disruptions that are taking place, and on that note, I have Reuters senior metals columnist Andy Home on this week's show. We go in depth on aluminum as well as tungsten, which is also making some headlines, as well as the Strait of Hormuz. So a very topical show on the metals here with a true expert in this business, following the metals quite closely since the 80s. So a lot to learn from Andy Home, again, senior metals columnist at Reuters, who's very generous with his time. It is an extended interview, so lots to look forward to there. As prep for that interview, big story came out this morning in the Financial Times. Car makers rush to secure aluminium, as they say in the UK, as Middle East war hits supply. And this is by Harry Dempsey and Camilla Hodgson, Kana Inagaki, and Leslie Hook for the FT. The war in the Middle East has triggered, quote, panic buying of aluminum by some of the world's biggest car makers amid fears that supplies could run out within months if the conflict persists. Again, we discussed this in depth in our feature interview on this week's episode. Gulf producers, including Aluminium Bahrain and Quadalum, have cut production with disruption to power supplies and shipping bottlenecks hitting both raw material imports and exports. Aluminium is widely used in industries from car making to aerospace and construction. Indeed, and one of the miracles of aluminum is it is a lightweight metal. So transportation in particular, as well as it says here, aerospace, it's particularly useful in that regard. Executives at car parts companies and aluminum producers said car makers were trying to build up contingency stocks as the war enters its fourth week. Quote, if the situation continues, there will be more panic buying, said an executive at an aluminum producer. We have lived through crises in the past, but this one is very different. So not only is this a crisis, but this is a new order of magnitude crisis. And again, we've seen the word panic twice already in this article. Several Western car makers told the FT they are having problems securing new aluminum supplies. Many are drawing on inventories expected to last a few months, with one noting that a large aluminum shipment left the Gulf shortly before the war began. Another car maker said it was using scrap rather than new metal as much as possible. Traders in Japan said the country's car makers and suppliers were also considering buying supplies from Russia, having chosen to boycott the country since its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022. Quote, we don't really want to take supplies from Russia, but we have no choice, said one Japanese trader. Toyota chief executive Koji Sato said Japanese car makers were working to find alternative sources of aluminum, noting the country's reliance on the Middle East for the metal. Europe, the US, and Japan are all major importers of aluminum from the Gulf, which accounts for almost 10% of global refined output. Europe sources 14% of its imports from the region, compared with 25% for Japan. Supplies from the Gulf are exposed to the near standstill in shipping through the Strait of Hormuz, while surging gas prices have prompted producers elsewhere to warn of reduced production. An executive at a Japanese automotive supplier that buys thousands of tons of aluminum a month said there was, quote, huge uproar in the market and that production cuts at its factory would be necessary within 4 months if supplies from the Middle East remain disrupted. So again, when we're discussing industrial metals, this is a whole other order of magnitude here. This isn't, not having enough samarium for your missiles. This is, look around you. You can probably find some aluminum in your visual field. It continues, quote, "It's very difficult to cover the full volumes lost from the Middle East," the executive said. "It's a very delicate supply chain. It's hard to see any end to this." Another metals trader said European car makers might need to begin cutting production as early as June or July unless the conflict eases. The price of aluminum on the London Metal Exchange rose as much as 12% after the outbreak of the war, though has since fallen back. Regional premiums in the US, Europe, and Japan paid on top of the benchmark price have risen much more, according to analysts and traders. The Japanese executive said prices were up 30 to 40%. Some products are in particularly short supply, such as the alloys to make wheels and other car parts, as well as the aluminum blocks that are used in automotive manufacturing. One trader in Europe said car makers were particularly exposed because of their strict specific requirements, meaning it can take up to 18 months to bring in an alternative supplier. Ford had already faced significant disruption to production on its top-selling F-150 pickup truck before the war, following a fire at an aluminum supplier's plant in New York. And this is the thing. We've been seeing smelters close in a regular trickle of headlines for months, if not years. So this is coming on top of an already dicey situation here. At a recent conference, Ford's chief operating officer Kumar Galhotra said the war had not affected its supply chain so far. The company declined to comment on its aluminum supplies. Dan Hirsch, a purchasing and supply chain specialist at consultancy Alex Partners, said companies were warning, quote, "I can't afford to have my supply chain disrupted," or "I can't afford to pay what I think aluminum is going to cost in a month." But the bigger issue is that this is on top of tariffs and other disruptions last year, end quote. So, although 10% may not seem like the end of the world, it was coming on top of there already being issues in the aluminum market, as we were seeing with Ford there, tariffs and smelters shutting down and whatnot. So we have an update on an aluminum producer in the Middle East. Bahrain's Alba routes aluminum exports via Jeddah due to Hormuz closure. So I encourage you to look this up on a map. Jeddah is on the Red Sea on the coast of Saudi Arabia. So you can start to just get a picture of what's going on here. I was mentioning last week, will the supply chains reroute? And it seems like it's hard for oil. Oil seems to need tankers, but when you're dealing with something that can theoretically be put on a train or perhaps even on a truck, all of a sudden you start to not need that Strait of Hormuz. So let's take a closer look here. This is Reuters via mining.com. Aluminium Bahrain, known as Alba, is sending metal to export markets via the Saudi port of Jeddah, its CEO said, as the Gulf smelter's normal route to world markets via the Strait of Hormuz remains effectively closed. Alba CEO Ali Bakali also said the company was looking at ways of importing raw material alumina, of which it has almost 1 month of stock remaining, and had received additional supply from Saudi smelter Ma'aden. So the longer this war goes on, of course, the worse it gets. It's almost exponential here. Al-Bakali told an investor call on Wednesday Alba was sending 40 to 60% of exports via Saudi Arabia, despite having already declared force majeure and cut production, and had not seen its transportation costs increase significantly. Very interesting. It had not seen its transportation costs increase significantly. Quote, "We are using Jeddah Port, for example, for exporting our metals. We are incurring the land cost. However, we are able to meet our commitment to our customers on time," he said, according to a transcript released on Thursday. So Alba has declared force majeure, but it does sound like they're still trying to meet their obligations despite force majeure, interestingly. Jeddah on Saudi Arabia's Red Sea coast is around 1,400 kilometers overland from Alba, the world's biggest aluminum smelter, on one site. Alba has not imported any alumina via the Red Sea so far, Al-Bakali said, thanking Ma'aden for the extra supply. Quote, "They are supporting us in this difficult time he said. Again, it just seems biological almost, the way these supply chains reroute. It's quite fascinating. History in real time over here, at least on a weekly basis on the Northern Miner podcast. Let's continue. Alcoa draws new aluminum orders as Gulf states curb production. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com on March 17th. Alcoa Corp, the largest U.S. aluminum producer, says it's fielding interest from buyers seeking alternative supply following the curtailment of production in the Middle East. Quote, we're actually seeing an uptick in orders from customers and inquiries related to the second quarter and second half of the year, because these were customers who take a portion or a majority of supply from Middle East smelters, said Chief Financial Officer Molly Bierman at a J.P. Morgan Chase conference on Tuesday. Quote, so we do have additional spot orders coming in, and that should help us later in the year. Aluminum buyers are looking to find different sources of material while shipping through the Strait of Hormuz is effectively closed. Smelters in the Gulf states, which produce about 9% of global supply, curtailed production last week and over the weekend to conserve raw materials. So that's interesting. So it was to conserve raw materials. So I wonder, people talk about how these facilities are a huge effort to turn on and off. It's not simply pressing a button. So one wonders if they are reducing their supply in order to prolong the production at the smelter and, in a sense, prolong the deadline that they have before they actually have to start turning things off. Alcoa, which is also a major producer of alumina, ships around 4 million metric tons of the raw material to the Middle East to power its smelters every year, according to Bierman. Now, following the closing of the Strait of Hormuz, quote, all of that supply that normally would have moved into the Middle East is finding a home elsewhere, probably moving into China, end quote. So fascinating developments there. Now, continuing on, we have an update. Japan Prime Minister Takaichi visiting the U.S., they discussed rare earths. Interestingly, we had this headline that followed yesterday from the South China Morning Post. China cuts exports of 2 high-tech metals to Japan, increases rare earth shipments. Now, this is interesting because this feeds into something I've been discussing here, which is when we see these headlines of rare earth exports up or down without the specifics, it gives a myopic view or a cloudy view of what is happening. This is a case in point here. This is by Ralph Jennings and Mia Nurmamat at the South China Morning Post. China has cut exports of 2 metals used in military technology to Japan, while increasing shipments of rare earth magnets in what could signal a muted warning after geopolitical tensions between the 2 Asian economies flared last year. Exports of gallium to Japan registered 0 volume in the first 2 months of the year, compared with 8,007 kilograms in the same period of 2025. Customs data showed. Germanium exports were also at 0 in January and February, compared with 400 kilograms a year earlier. So, magnet exports are higher, germanium and gallium are nil. And so when we see these headlines, rare earth exports up in Japan, as I've been commenting on previous shows, these are borderline meaningless, if not worse than meaningless, because they become misleading. Now, with that in mind, let's take a look. We have a story. China's rare earth exports rise, shipments to U.S. fall. Chinese exports of rare earth magnets rose 8.2% from a year earlier in the first 2 months of 2026, customs data showed on Friday, although shipments to the U.S. dipped. Now, are we going to get more details here? Exports from the world's largest producer of rare earth magnets, which are used in everything from cell phones to automobiles to the defense sector, stood at 10,700 metric tons between January and February, data from the General Administration of Customs showed. Germany, South Korea, the U.S., Vietnam, and France were China's top 5 rare earth magnet export destinations between January and February. Exports to the U.S. slid 22% from a year earlier to 994 tons in January and February, although month-to-month data can be volatile. The White House on Wednesday confirmed that U.S. President Donald Trump's upcoming trip to China to meet President Xi Jinping has been delayed. It was later revealed that the trip would be postponed by about a month and a half. Exports to Japan rose 9.5% to 444 tons during the same period, despite China blocking exports to some military and industrial companies. China placed several rare earths and associated magnets on an export control list in April, Exports of many types have risen steadily since then, although niche elements like yttrium used in defense and aerospace remain tightly controlled. Now, this report in the South China Morning Post followed quite an interesting headline from a couple of weeks ago. An exclusive, could China's rare earth supplies dictate how long U.S. strikes on Iran go on? And in this article, they're basically saying that the U.S. has around 2 months of rare earths inventories. Sources told the South China Morning Post, on condition of anonymity due to the sensitivity of the issue, that Washington had only around 2 months of rare earths inventory and the supplies would dominate talks when Trump sat down with Chinese President Xi Jinping. So it's quite interesting here. Again, the headlines can say exports up, but if you're getting zero germanium and gallium, or samarium for that matter, I'm not sure where that leaves you. And finally, on the rare earths, we do have an update from Lynas Rare Earths from the Northern Miner. Lynas Rare Earths produces first samarium, and samarium's important in missiles. Of course, the New York Times last year writing a huge article on the issue with samarium, and this is March 23rd, yesterday. Lynas Rare Earths has produced its first samarium oxide from its plant in Malaysia, becoming the only non-Chinese producer of the mineral. This expands Lynas's range of separated heavy rare earth oxide products to 3, alongside dysprosium and terbium, which it began producing last summer. The latest milestone further enhances the company's position as the only commercial producer of separated heavy rare earths outside China, the Australian miner said in a March 19th release. Samarium oxide, used in high-performance magnets for electronics and aerospace, as well as optical catalysts and medical applications, is another niche metals market earning notoriety as countries and companies in the West try to chip away at China's dominance in metals extraction and refining. So, interesting development there. Now, just a few more stories as we scan the world's headlines, and we're going to have an update on iron ore and China and CMRG in our news section. Lots going on over there. And just finally, as we wrap up here, just a few headlines. U.S.-backed group buys Democratic Republic of Congo copper cobalt mine under minerals deal, and this is the Financial Times. Acquisition will create first major American-owned mine in the African country in more than a decade. And that is by Leslie Hook in London, and this is on March 17th. American company Virtus Minerals is poised to buy Chamath, a troubled miner in the Democratic Republic of Congo, marking the first commercial deal born out of the growing mineral partnership between the U.S. and the African nation. A consortium led by Virtus will pay $30 million to acquire the company, only $30 million, and will renegotiate its extensive debts. It plans to invest about $300 million to complete Chamath's Mutoshi copper cobalt mine, according to people familiar with the deal. So we have a deal there in Congo. Also, we have the first copper shipments through Africa's Libido Corridor, and this is Business Insider Africa. Africa's Libido Corridor records first copper shipments as Canadian miner exports 99.7% anodes to Europe. So Ivanhoe's Robert Friedland announces the first ever copper export via the Libido Corridor. So this is being described as low carbon intensive refined copper, and it is being sent over to Arubis AG for further refining at its low-carbon facilities. So Ivanhoe producing low-carbon copper through the Libido Corridor. So lots to discuss here. Senior Metals Columnist Andy Home in our extended interview on this week's episode. If you want to find us online, you can find us at northernminer.com. You can find us on X at Northern Miner, and on Facebook, LinkedIn, and YouTube, where we also host these podcasts. And wherever podcasts are available, including Spotify, SoundCloud, and Apple Podcasts. And with that, let's turn to the news. Turning to the website, China spent $120 billion to lock down critical minerals overseas, according to a report. This by a staff writer at northernminer.com. China has invested more than $120 billion in overseas mining and upstream processing since 2023, accelerating a state-backed push to secure the raw materials underpinning the global energy transition, says Australian think tank Climate Energy Finance. What's interesting about that is when you think of all of the pledges that have been made in the West since 2023, I don't know if it would make $120 billion. We just heard $12 billion from the U.S. recently for stockpiling. So let's continue and see what it says. A study published last week reveals that China's spending targeted a wide range of commodities, including lithium, copper, nickel, rare earths, and bauxite, that are essential for electric vehicles, renewable power, and industrial decarbonization. The scale of the push reflects what the authors describe as a coordinated strategy of, quote, green energy statecraft, end quote, in which Beijing is working to dominate not just resource extraction, but the full value chain that turns raw materials into battery-grade and industrial inputs. The CEF research also finds that China's outbound investment in mining is only one piece of a much larger industrial strategy. Since early 2023, Chinese firms have also deployed more than $220 billion in downstream sectors, such as battery manufacturing, electric vehicles, grids, solar, and wind infrastructure, creating what researchers describe as a vertically integrated global cleantech expansion. Together, upstream resource investments and downstream manufacturing form a unified system designed to secure supply, reduce dependence on foreign inputs, and reinforce China's position at the center of the low-carbon economy. That dominance is already evident. According to CEF estimates, China now controls about 90% of global rare earth refining, roughly 60% of lithium processing, more than 70% of cobalt refining, and over half of global steel production. It also produces more than 90% of battery cathode and anode materials. So I don't know if I'd consider that a surprise, but pretty interesting to hear. Continuing on the Chinese mining front, we have a story by Cecilia Jamasmi at mining.com. Zijin unit gains control of rival Chifeng in $2.6 billion deal. Zijin Gold is acquiring a controlling stake in Chifeng Jilong Gold Mining for $2.64 billion, reinforcing its position as China's largest gold producer. The unit of Zijin Mining Group will purchase the existing mainland-listed shares and newly issued Hong Kong shares, lifting its interest to nearly 26% and securing effective control with full financial consolidation, the company said. Chifeng sold about 14.4 tons of gold last year from operations in China, Ghana, Laos, and compared with Zijin Gold's 46.6 tons. Zijin will assume operational control of Chifeng, quote, further solidifying its position as China's top gold miner, Bloomberg intelligence analysts said in a note on Monday. They added the target will benefit from improved efficiency under Zijin's management. So, a little bit of M&A in the Chinese gold sector. And a follow-up story, this is from Bloomberg News via mining.com. Zijin's investment unit aims to expand strategic metal portfolio. Zijin Mining Group, China's biggest gold and copper producer, wants to invest in metals like tungsten and uranium as a global bid to secure critical minerals drives prices higher. Quote, we are looking to expand our position in tungsten and other strategic metals, end quote, including uranium, Lisa Liu, managing director and portfolio manager of Gold Mountain Asset Management, said in a recent interview. As a wholly owned subsidiary of Zijin, the firm manages some of the mining giant's financial investments, including stakes in Montage Gold and Equinox Gold. Gold Mountains has over $6 billion in assets under management, with around 75% in gold and the rest in copper, lithium, uranium, and other metals. Tungsten, a super-dense material used in drilling equipment and armor-piercing weaponry, has more than doubled in value this year due to Chinese export curbs and rising military demand. Prices of uranium, the fuel in nuclear reactors, have also rallied over the past few years in anticipation of a surge in atomic energy demand. Mines containing rare earths are also on the company's radar, said Liu, but good projects are hard to come by, and, quote, many of them are either very expensive or will need a long time, end quote, before becoming productive, she said. Gold Mountains has a sizable cash buffer that could be invested in a project at once. Quote, if a major shareholder suddenly looks to offload a large stake, we can step in and absorb it immediately, said Liu. So Gold Mountain Asset Management is a wholly owned subsidiary of Zijin, and they are looking to make investments beyond gold and copper. So continues to be interesting out of China. No slowing down over there. Continuing on, the iron ore saga between China and BHP. Let's take a look here. We have a column from Reuters. China's robust iron ore imports are going into storage, not steel. This is Reuters on March 20th via mining.com. So last week, we heard how China gave a week-long opportunity for CMRG, its iron ore buyer, to purchase BHP's iron ore. Now let's see what the latest is. China increased imports of iron ore at the start of this year, but the extra volumes are being used to build inventories to record highs rather than lift steel production. The increase in imports appears largely driven by softer prices for the key steel raw material, but it is also fortuitous given the potential for the fallout from the US and Israeli attacks on Iran to spread beyond energy markets. China, which buys about 3/4 of global seaborne iron ore, saw arrivals of 210 million metric tons in the first 2 months of 2026, up 10% from the same period a year earlier, according to customs data released on March 10th. The robust start to the year came after imports hit a record monthly high of 120 million tons in December, which took arrivals for 2025 to an all-time annual high of 1.26 billion tons. And it is not because of higher steel production, so they are stockpiling. Another follow-up story, India takes rare cargo of BHP iron ore banned by China. This is Reuters on March 18th via mining.com. A cargo of BHP's Jimblebar Fines iron ore is heading to India in a rare sale driven by discounts on the product that was banned for sale in China, the world's largest buyer, as part of a contract dispute with the miner. Now, I thought we heard last week that they were making an exception for a week because of the war. Let's continue. The vessel True Champion is carrying some 172,000 metric tons of Jimblebar fines to Jagar in India. According to Kepler data, the buyer is JSW Steel, according to a source briefed on the sale. True Champion was destined for China on March 9th, Kepler data showed, before changing its destination to Singapore and then India over the course of the last week. China's state iron ore buyer, CMRG, barred steelmakers and traders from purchasing Jimblebar fines in September, and has progressively expanded its restrictions to other products as it negotiates the terms of BHP's 2026 supply contract, which repeatedly were seen as about taking the yuan over the dollar. Finally, CMRG relaxed the ban for a week last Friday, allowing steelmakers to buy Jimblebar cargoes already at Chinese ports. Seaborne cargoes are still banned, so there is the rub. So if the Jimblebar cargoes are already at port in China, they can be bought. If not, they cannot be. Continuing on, another related story, Fortescue bets on China ties as CMRG broadens iron ore influence. It's Bloomberg News via mining.com on March 23rd, yesterday. Fortescue expects its extensive use of Chinese capital and mining equipment to set it apart from rival iron ore producers as Beijing seeks to extend its influence in the market, Chief Executive Officer Dino Otranto said in an interview. And we've been seeing this as Fortescue has been working a lot more closely with China on this notion of green iron ore in the past. Speaking on Bloomberg Television, Otranto said state-backed iron ore buyer China Mineral Resource Group has told him from the start that it wanted better terms and to bring in more investment. Quote, the message was very clear. We procure all of your iron ore. You get all your equipment from the U.S. We need to look at opening up that relationship, he said on the sidelines of the China Development Forum. Otranto said that Fortescue had already taken significant steps to source equipment from Chinese suppliers, including by placing a large order for trucks. Last August, the company secured a $2 billion loan from lenders, including mainland banks, in an effort to diversify away from the U.S. This could position Fortescue as, quote, a unique offering in the market compared to some of our peers, Otranto said. And continuing on the iron ore market, iron ore miners could face billions more in fuel costs due to Iran war, Fortescue says, and this is by Reuters, also on March 23rd, via mining.com. Iron ore miners are at risk of incurring billions of dollars more in fuel costs if diesel prices continue to rise, a senior executive at Australia's Fortescue said on Monday. The U.S.-Israeli war on Iran has all but stopped shipments through the Strait of Hormuz, sending oil and gas prices higher and tightening the supply of diesel, a main transport fuel for the mining sector. Benchmark Singapore diesel swaps were trading at slightly more than $180 a barrel on Monday, up from $92.50 a barrel before the war broke out, LSEG data showed, so almost double, from $92.50 to $180 a barrel. Quote, a 10-cent change in the price of diesel impacts us by $70 million, said Dino Otranto, Metals and Operations Chief Executive Officer at global miner Fortescue, in an interview on Monday. Quote, if you look at our competitors, the top four, Every 10-cent movement has a $500 million impact on the cost structure. End quote. The company gets most of its fuel from Southeast Asia, but was, quote, comfortable with current fuel stocks, he said, as long as the war in Iran does not escalate. The world's largest iron ore supplier has set some of the most ambitious decarbonization targets among Australia's major miners, which Otranto said had helped it save fuel costs. He said Fortescue would save at least $100 million over the next 12 months on diesel costs from its push to electrify operations with renewable energy. The company planned to cut consumption by 1 billion liters of diesel equivalent over the next few years. Quote, we announced a very aggressive decarbonization agenda some years ago, he said. For a number of years, that plan has been met with a lot of criticism. But now the tides are shifting. Now our shareholders say, you need to do this faster, said Otranto. Indeed. That is the sense out there, isn't it? Which is, we can't electrify fast enough with everything that is happening in the Persian Gulf. So super interesting there. Another headline, U.S. snubbed by Lula government at Critical Minerals Summit. This is Bloomberg News via mining.com on March 18th. U.S. efforts to forge a major critical minerals partnership with Brazil are stalling as the South American nation struggles to finalize its own plans for the sector and political tensions rise ahead of presidential elections later this year. Washington has sought to deepen ties with Brazil, home to the largest rare earth reserves outside China, as well as significant deposits of other minerals essential to modern technology, especially as Beijing places new restrictions on supplies. Brazil is eager for investment necessary to realize its potential as a critical minerals powerhouse. But President Luiz Inácio Lula da Silva's government has failed to deliver a national mining plan initially aimed to complete last year, and a bill establishing a policy for critical minerals remains stuck in Congress. And final headline, the Canadian Mining Hall of Fame calls for nominations. That is by Blair McBride on the Northern Miner, and that is March 23rd. The Canadian Mining Hall of Fame has opened its call for nominations for the 2027 induction season. Hard to believe. The Hall each year seeks to bring into its ranks remarkable people whose induction is celebrated at its annual gala. So you can read all of the details on northernminer.com. Those are your news stories. Now, let's take a look at metal prices. And turning to metal prices, let's take a quick look at the bond market for context. Big moves happening in the bond market. U.S. 10-year bond is yielding 4.36%. That is 0.16% higher than last week, continuing a several-week rally. The UK 10-year gilt is yielding 4.93%. That is 0.12% higher on the week. I believe it was above 5% last week. Italy's 10-year bond is yielding 3.92%. That is 0.26% higher than last week, so up 0.25% on Italy's 10-year bond. France's 10-year bond is yielding 3.73%. That is 0.17% higher than last week. Germany's 10-year Bund breaks 3%, yielding 3.01%. That is 0.1% higher. Japan's 10-year bond is yielding 2.26%. That is 0.01% lower than last week, but still at elevated levels, and China's 10-year bond is unchanged at 1.83%. So bond yields looking like they are on the move higher, interestingly. Turning to precious metals, gold is trading at $4,409.20 per ounce. That is $603 lower than last week. Silver is trading at $69.58 per ounce. That is $11 lower than last week. Platinum is trading at $1,871.10 per ounce. That is $218 lower than last week. And palladium is trading at $1,439.50 per ounce. That is $174 lower than last week. And don't forget, 2 months ago, we were at 2,120 on palladium, and now we're at 1,439. Incredible. Turning to industrial metals, copper is trading at $5.46 per pound. That is 32 cents lower than last week. Iron ore is trading at $105.89 per metric ton. That is 75 cents higher than last week, so bucking the trend there. Aluminum is trading at $1.46 per pound. That is 8 cents lower than last week, perhaps surprisingly based on the headlines. Lead is unchanged at 86 cents per pound. Nickel is lower at $7.76 per pound. That is 16 cents lower than last week. Tin is below $20 a pound at $19.63 per pound. That is $1.62 lower than last week. Cobalt is unchanged at $25.53 per pound. Lithium is lower at $21.28 per kilogram. That is $1.44 lower than last week. Uranium is trading at $84.40 per pound. That is $1.25 lower than last week. And zinc is also lower at $1.40 per pound. That is 8 cents lower on the week. So overall, metals lower, with the big exception being iron ore, edging higher. And those are your metal prices. Coming up, I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time to the Northern Miner Podcast, Andy Home, senior metals columnist at Reuters. We discuss the aluminum market in depth, as well as what's happening in tungsten, and also the new investment climate in metals and how that is changing these markets, the huge volumes we're seeing. Andy Home gives us his take on it, so a fascinating interview with a true expert in the business, following it since the 80s. I hope you enjoy the conversation, and I will see you on the other side. Join us today. I'm very pleased to welcome for the first time to the Northern Miner Podcast, Andy Home, senior metals columnist at Reuters. Andy, it's great to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me along to have this conversation. A really interesting time to be talking about metals, right?
It sure is, and you've been covering them in a very unique and specific way that we're not seeing anywhere else. And, I've been meaning to reach out to you for months and perhaps even years, Andy. And then finally, with your recent articles on aluminum and the Strait of Hormuz, the big story really in the metals markets among many, I just finally had to bridge that gap. So before we start, though, since it is your first time, you're senior metals columnist at Reuters. Can you give us a little bit of background on yourself and how you got involved in metals markets?
Well, we're going to go back to the mists of time here, otherwise known as 1987. And I joined the London office of a US publication called Metals Week, which after many iterations, because this is what always happens in the media business, things change and change names. That's become S&P Global Platts, right? But when I was there, it was a very specialist newsletter going out once a week. We sent out daily updates via telex, if anyone's old enough to remember what a telex is, right? And there were just two of us working in that London office. And then I myself, I got chopped and changed between titles at McGraw-Hill, which then was the owner of Metals Week. I joined a real-line news agency called Knight Ridder, sadly deceased many years ago in the 1990s. Then period in the early noughties, I set up my own company with a colleague. We called it Metals Insider. And long story short, we ended up selling that to Reuters in 2008. And ever since then, I've been doing my commentary for Reuters. But my history of metals is a very long one indeed. So long that back in 1987, my first job as the junior reporter was copper. Now, that's kind of like a strange choice, you might think. But at those days, copper was almost regarded as a legacy sunset metal, right? We were only using it for wiring telephones, about to be replaced by fiber optics. We were using it for plumbing, about to be replaced by plastics. Now, I know this is going to sound really strange, given how critical we all know copper is now. But that's how much I've seen this industry evolve and change. These metals keep on finding new uses, right? And my view is that we are entering a new metals age. Remember, copper gave us the name of the Bronze Age, right? But we're coming into a new metals age now, people, because I think we've all realized if the world is going to decarbonize and get rid of fossil fuels, current technology means the only way we can do that is via metals.
Indeed. And, even beyond the decarbonization, it seems like technology itself is kind of driving to a certain degree the need for these metals, rare earths with robotics and whatnot. But you've been writing on aluminum in the last few weeks since the war began in Iran. And of course, the troubles and blockages really at the Strait of Hormuz and what's going on with the aluminum supply. And of course, the Middle East, as you've been writing, provides 9% of global supply. What's going on with aluminum? How big of a deal is this? Can you characterize the situation and to a certain degree, the urgency of the situation for the listeners?
Yeah, so first off, I'm going to have to apologize to all your North American listeners because I'm going to insist on mispronouncing aluminum as aluminium. So please forgive me for that, right? But yeah, look, everyone understands, I think, the importance of the Strait of Hormuz to the energy markets. But what we forget is aluminium is kind of solid energy, right? We produce it through electrolysis. We don't just throw it into blast furnace. It requires massive amounts of power. Why does the Middle East generally have such a big aluminium footprint? Well, of course, it's long power, right? Whether it be gas, whether it be oil. And as part of its diversification, rather than just being a liquid energy producer, they started building out large amounts of aluminium capacity, right? Across the UAE, in Saudi Arabia, in Oman, and actually in Iran itself, right? It is a derivative of oil from that point of view. And as you said, well, that simple fact, well, the region accounts for like 9 to 10% of global production. That is true. But aluminium is a weird and slightly fractured global market, right? The biggest producer by far is China, but China uses most of the aluminium it produces, or it transforms it into products to send to us in the West, all right? If you take China out of this equation, so, if I was talking to a European aluminium buyer who asked me how important is the Gulf, I said, well, since you're not realistically going to be buying from China, the Gulf accounts for over 20% of what's available to you. And actually, it gets worse because you previously bought stuff from the Russians, right? With huge aluminium producers as well. They're sanctioned out. So now suddenly the Gulf is accounting for maybe 30 to 40% of what is available to you as a Western buyer of primary aluminium. So we have two issues here. One is direct attacks on energy infrastructure in the region. And we have seen two big aluminium smelters reduce capacity due to a shortfall of gas in the case of sort of like Qatar and in aluminium Bahrain. So we we're seeing something like 600,000 tons of annual capacity being powered down in a controlled way, right? That's fine. But the bigger problem is the closure of the Strait of Hormuz. Because just as energy has to get out to supply the rest of the world, so does aluminium have to get out to supply the rest of the world. And here's the rub. Raw materials have to go the other way to supply these smelters, right? There is only one Middle Eastern smelter in Saudi, which is fully integrated with bauxite mine and with alumina refinery for the intermediate product. All the other Gulf producers are either importing alumina or they're importing bauxite. Now, no one reveals how many in-house stocks they have for obvious commercial reasons, but the longer this goes on, we have a double problem. It's the stuff that's not coming out, the product, but also the raw materials that aren't going in. And at some stage, the longer this goes on, that's going to become an ever bigger headache for the guys operating there. So that's where we are. 10% sounds livable with in terms of global production, but that's not the reality for a European buyer or a North American buyer of primary aluminium. That Gulf is much more important than just 10%. And that's why you saw, last week, you saw the London Metal Exchange aluminium price rocket up to a 4-year high, which is kind of a knee-jerk reaction, right? It's kind of come back a bit since then as the aluminium market, like everyone else, tries to make sense of the headlines. But what you're seeing now is a very real impact on what I call the physical supply chain, by which I mean that if you're in the business of buying physical aluminium, the premium you're paying over and above the LME is now like really going ever higher, right? Whether you're in Japan, whether you're in Europe, or whether you're in the United States, you are going to pay more just to get physical metal.
Very interesting. And when you describe the premium, when we see the price, say online, or when you describe it being at multi-year highs, does that include the premium?
So let's give you an example. I told you this is quite a fractured market, right? So let's look at the aluminium market through the lens of a Midwest US manufacturer, right? Who's making widgets out of aluminium, right? So this guy's going to be paying a two-part price. The first is what we would call the basis price. That's the London Metal Exchange price. And that at the moment is about over $3,000 per ton, right? Now, to physically get my metal into my yard, I'm going to pay a premium, a delivery premium. Now, in times gone by, that would be the trucking cost maybe from a major arrival point, or maybe a trucking point from Canada, which is a big supplier to the US market. But here's the thing. US President Donald Trump initiated import tariffs of 50% last year on all aluminium products, right? That means that now I'm going to pay extra physically to get hold of my metal over and above the LME price. So just to give you an example, right now in the US, I've got my 3,000 plus basis price, and the premium over and above that is running at about $2,400. Yeah. So I, as a US physical buyer, am paying over $5,000 per ton to get metal into my yard. So we've got a combination of a high outright price in the international market, right? We've got, sort of like the tariff impact, which is a 50% of the price. And then we've got another sort of like, what I call a scarcity premium on top of that, right? Which, of course, everything has been made worse by what's going on in the Strait of Hormuz, because the US also gets some of its aluminium from those Gulf producers. So think about that. So yeah, when we're talking about the physical premium, it is over and above the LME price. So right now in the US, you're paying over $5,000 per ton for your metal.
Incredible. And so, as you describe it, then we have an import problem of, say, the bauxite or alumina coming into the smelters. There's an export problem of how to get the metal out. We saw, Alba just mentioned recently that they're sending some of it over to Jeddah in the Red Sea in Saudi Arabia. So maybe certain solutions there. But then there seems to be a whole other issue, as you point out. This is, as they sometimes call it, congealed electricity. Then there's the actual gas, like we saw in India. There was a smelter that seemed to shut down, but it wasn't because of a lack of raw materials. It was because of the gas issue that they're having. So it seems like there's a storm that's happening all at once here. What do you think of that? Are we sort of getting things piling on top of each other here, or is the gas issue not as big of an issue as I'm making it out to be?
Absolutely spot on. It goes back to how we make aluminium, right? We do not throw it aluminum into a blast furnace and heat it up, right? We pass an electrical current through it to sort of make metal out of it. So think about that. So a modern-sized aluminium smelter is going to use as much power every year as something like the city of Boston, right? That's obviously every second of every minute of every hour. This is a continuous process, right? That means, first off, gas security or whatever power you're using, power security is the critical one, right? You cannot lose power in an aluminium smelter. It has a very, very bad impact on your production process. But it also means that power is your single biggest cost component. And what we saw, let's just go and flash back to a few years now. So when we saw Russia launch its full-scale invasion of Ukraine in 2022, we saw a massive spike in energy prices, right? That took down about 4, 5, 6 aluminium smelters in Europe because they were kind of like dependent on a spot market rates for energy, and the price just went to a level they could not make money, right? Some of those, funnily enough, have only just started sort of like coming back online, and here we get the second big energy problem, right? So aluminium smelting is power intensive. It is always going to be very responsive to the price of power. If you are lucky enough to have a 20-year contract, evergreen contract with your local supplier, brilliant. But a lot of Western smelters have historically not had that sort of privilege and have been dependent on spot power rates. So anything that moves that spot price is very, very bad for those smelters, yeah? So now you're absolutely spot on. This is the second vulnerability, if you like. We have a very immediate vulnerability of supply in the Gulf itself. But if we see a widespread energy crisis similar to what happened in 2022, it's creating problems for everyone who's using power, right? And aluminium smelters are at the front of that queue.
As you point out, we've seen smelters shut down over the years as well. I just saw a headline on mining.com, Rio Tinto shuts bauxite mine. as cyclone hits northern Australia. It's like we've been watching these headlines for what feels like months and even years here of these smelters shutting down. There was another one recently. Was it in Mozambique?
Yeah.
Right? So in terms of stocks then, we saw these stories recently that Mercuria took a whole bunch off the market and that people are taking delivery. What is your understanding of, say, stocks on the LME? Like, again, I'm kind of back to this, like, how urgent is this from your perspective?
Let's just rewind a little bit to answer that question. And it kind of answers, I think, two parts of the same question, if you like. The reason we've never really had a panic in aluminium before, not for the last 20, 30 years I've been writing about it, is that every time maybe the price all right started moving up or, there was a concept of a shortage, what would happen? China would just build some more smelters. Right? I mean, China has grown from being a marginal producer only 25 years ago to now being the 60% global dominant producer, right? And actually, it's China overcapacity that also played its role in taking out a lot of Western smelters over the years, yeah? And what's really changed for aluminium at a really fundamental level, even before, this war in Iran, whatever, is China has stopped building any more smelters, right? The government, I think it was about 8 years ago, again, for energy conservation reasons, said, okay, guys, you're building up. We're going to put a mandated capacity cap on the whole lot of you, right? 45 million tons per year. Well, right now, Chinese production is running up against that cap, and no one is getting permission to build any more smelters, right? So from that point of view, the West, to some extent, we lambasted China for dumping products onto our markets. We stopped building smelters. We struggled to keep even what we had alive because of Chinese overproduction. But now, of course, led us into a place of complacency, I think, right? I think a lot of people didn't believe that China would actually stick to this capacity cap, but there were no signs whatsoever that Beijing is going to change its mind about this. There might be a little bit of flex in the system. But this idea of, we're in trouble, China will just activate another bit of its capacity it's not using, and by hook or by crook, it will find its way to Western markets, and we don't need to worry. That's what's really changed, right? And I think as a result of that, what you've seen is China has been exporting less semi-manufactured product, which is what they tend to export more than primary metal. It's even started buying more primary metal, right, from the Russians in particular. So for about a year and a half ago, China's sort of changing role in this market started to lead to, I call it, just an almost hardly noticed drawdown in the inventory everywhere else. It wasn't a big deal, but, and enemy stocks, which, we've had millions of tons sitting in enemy warehouses over the years, stuff gets rotated onto warrant, off to warrant. It all becomes a warehousing arbitrage thing, right? So, someone cancels 200,000 tons. Who cares? They've just taken it off market. It's going to be redelivered again under a better warehousing deal, right? We all got used to this. What you've seen over the last few months, when stuff leaves now, it's not going into the storage shadows to come back. It's being absorbed into the physical supply chain, right? So having had really decades of huge aluminium stocks, we don't anymore, right? So when I look at LME stocks, for example, we see what we call the warranted stocks, which is kind of what everyone focuses on. The LME also releases stocks which are sitting off warrant. I call them the LME shadows. So those stocks combined now are well below 1 million tons, right, and falling. So when someone now goes to cancel 100,000 tons of metal, right, it has a really big impact. And on the pattern we've seen over the last year, they're not doing it to play around with warehousing rental arbitrage, right? This is going to meet physical demand. This is going to fill the gaps right now left by the blockade of shipments from the Gulf. So now we're in a situation when we have quite a lot of stocks and they're falling and it's not being recycled to come back into the LME again. It is literally leaving. Now, there's another little catch on this one, right? So when you look at what's left on warrants, say 4 weeks ago, about 450,000 tons, 500,000 tons, right? And as you pointed out, a couple of big names are taking like big chunks out of that. Cancelled metal in preparation for physical loadout. But here's the thing. They've been very selective of what LME stocks they have chosen. They have chosen the Indian brand metal, What they have not elected to take is the Russian brand metal. Because, right? I mean, Russian metal was only sanctioned a couple of years ago, right? 2024. And the LME said, well, look, if it was produced prior to that date and it's in our system, that's fine, right? We'll just stop any new deliveries of new production coming in. But what you have now then is as the non-Russian metal gets sort of like literally snatched out of the system now is becoming primarily determined by Russian brand metal, and a lot of Western buyers either can't take it or they won't take it.
Fascinating. And so this Russian metal, it appeared in stocks after the sanctions. Is that correct?
A lot of it was there beforehand.
Even before. So they're even saying we can't take this. Do you think they're going to be forced to? I mean, I'm asking you to speculate.
Look, I mean, some guys can't, right? So, like, I mean, there's US sanctions on Russian metal, meaning you cannot import. It's as simple as that, right? The EU is kind of phasing out Russian imports this year, right? I mean, some guys can take it. Turkey will take Russian metal. I think the South Koreans will take it. Some of the Asians will take it, right? But obviously, again, if we're talking about the guys who are really feeling the pinch in this market at the moment, which is the US buyer and the European buyer, Russian metal is not a great option, right? So, you know, even when I'm saying that our LME stocks have shrunk, what's really available, what's left for you and me as buyers, is actually a lot smaller than even the headlines suggest. If we cannot use that, either import that Russian metal, we don't want to. I mean, some guys have always self-sanctioned from that point of view. And that's a little bit why you're seeing physical premiums rocket as everyone tries to get alternative supply, right?
Okay, and as we wrap up on aluminum here, Andy, and this is super fascinating. I mean, are you seeing a scramble of sorts? And, you know, what are you looking for in the aluminum market here? Obviously, the Strait of Hormuz being closed and whether it's going to reopen or not. But I mean, overall, I mean, what's on your radar here? And are you seeing at all, you know, governments or corporations scramble to get their metal?
I think it's been a slow burn crisis. I mean, you know, we kind of know how rare earths are sort of like, I mean, have sort of seized all the headlines recently. Oh, yeah, we're too dependent on China. We can't get hold of them, et cetera, et cetera. And you mean it's been a real slow burn story because, as I said, we all got used to there just being, oh, so much around. Oh, the Chinese can always build some more. And only now we realize, hold on, we may have a problem here, right? So the US administration, it has obviously one of the reasons it's imposed tariffs is to try and sort of revitalize, regenerate its own smelters, sort of like, I mean, a sector. I think there's only 4 operating smelters left in the United States. There is a big new project that is being discussed, right? But again, here's the problem. You need the power, right? You need the power. And both the United States market, the European market, power is in quite short supply, right? Generally, specifically the United States, because if you're going to like build a new smelter at the cost of several $billion, right? You need to have that commitment from a power supplier for what, 10, 15, 20 years, right? But you're going to find yourself in direct competition with the AI guys, because guess who else needs a lot of power? The data center guys, right? So it's becoming a very difficult market from that point of view. I have argued for some time that the West really does need to sort of rebuild its primary aluminium smelter capacity. We can do a lot via recycling, and we can probably certainly do a lot more via recycling in terms of supply security. But actually, the world needs more primary smelters, or the world outside of China needs more primary smelters. And at the moment, not only are we not getting them, we're seeing guys close. I mean, you mentioned the Mozambique smelter, right? Couldn't get a power deal. We knew its power deal and what it felt was a sort of viable sort of like level. Power is the secret to aluminium, which is ironic because, I mean, of course, aluminium is how we're going to sort of like, I mean, decarbonize power, right?
Right.
We call it the aluminium paradox, if you like, right?
I
mean, I think this market, I mean, and I come up with this expression, I think it was Citi came up with this at the end of last year. So this is a market that's sleepwalking into serious potential deficits markets. And I think that's a very good description of it. And to some extent, what's happened, I mean, the Gulf crisis now has really, I think, woken people up to this fact, right? In a way that, oh, hold on, what, we all rely on these guys? Yeah, we actually all do rely on these guys producing the Gulf because we closed these smelters, and sort of China's sort of not building anymore. And, this was a market in transition from what I call decades of structural oversupply to a structural deficit. And now we just understood how much we're on the path, the transition path. And it's what's happening in the Gulf that's really, I think, been the wake-up call here.
Indeed. And, this is an industrial metal. This isn't some specialty metal here. I mean, this is aluminum, right? I mean, it's a whole order of
it's really hard to overstate. It's ubiquitous, right? I mean, we don't think of it, aluminium's everywhere. Right, we use it in packaging, we use it in cars, we use it in construction, we use it across 1,001 different sort of like manufacturing processes. But it's also kind of there's no green technology out there which doesn't need aluminium. Will it be the solar panels? It's used for the packaging of them, right? EVs, I want the lightest weight material that I can possibly find for my body chassis, right? It's going to be aluminium, right? You name it. Aluminium is somehow in this mix, right? As I said, you're right, because it's so ubiquitous, we don't even think of it as a critical metal, but it is a critical metal. And actually, given its ubiquity of usage, it's one of the ones that we would all notice if we don't get enough of it, right?
Well, we don't have unlimited time here with you, Andy, and I'd love to ask you just put out an article on tungsten, and we've been seeing headlines with the big rally in tungsten. So tungsten's had quite a ride, and you made the point that this is used in military uses, particularly missiles and ballistics, and that really when tungsten is used, it's consumed. It's not like you can recycle this stuff. What's going on in the tungsten market, and how urgent is that situation?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. When we whatever missiles you're talking about, whether it be a Patriot missile system or an interceptor missile system, it's going to have tungsten in it. Right. I mean, it is the super hard metal. I mean, it is used for what the defense sector, I think, euphemistically calls penetrators, by which I mean anti-armor, shells, bunker busters, you name it. It's going to have tungsten in it, and quite rightly. Well, if I fire a Patriot missile and get my target, I'm not going to get the tungsten back, but by definition, right, it has detonated. There is no recycling option here, right? Someone nicely came up, it was Amanda Van Dyke from the Critical Minerals Hub, has pointed out, missile math is mineral math, and tungsten is first and foremost in it. But by the way, there's all sorts of critical minerals in modern, missile technology, right? I mean, these are all classified sort of as secrets. But I read, for example, a tomahawk can have about 18, 19, 20 critical minerals in there, from rare earths to tungsten. But tungsten is the one that's really, it is the material of choice these days for the battlefield. It can only be replaced by, substituted by either depleted uranium, which kind of is quite weird, because then tungsten is sort of like your green choice of battlefield, right? Because no one wants to use depleted uranium. Now, we had a problem even before all this happened. The problem was, of course, like rare earths, tungsten is supply is dominated by one country. That country is China. And China put restrictions on exports of tungsten last year, since when prices have been going on a parabolic ascent, right, about all-time highs. I mean, as far as the price data goes back, this is the highest we've ever been. There was a real shortage right now. In that context, right, you have seen massive missile depletion of stocks, obviously, in what has been a very missile-intensive hostilities, right, by all sides. Those are going to have to be replaced, right? But replacing a missile isn't just give me a bit of steel, bit of aluminium, we'll bolt it together, Andy. No. Each one of those means replacing the critical minerals that make them so lethally effective, right? So we need to replace the tungsten. We can't rebuild missile stocks without rebuilding our tungsten stocks. And that becomes a problem, right? Because we're at record high prices. China is still restricting exports, particularly for military dual use capacity, right? Yeah, the West is desperately, a lot of money, federal money in the United States is flying into new tungsten mines, but guys, it's going to take time, right? And time is something we don't have right now. So there is a real physical squeeze on Western supplies of tungsten, just as there are on germanium or gallium or all the other stuff that China has restricted, right? But that obviously becomes paramount if you're a military planner, because, we need to replace what we've just been firing in the Gulf as a matter of priority, right? And the way I look at it as is this is must have from a military point of view. These guys will outbid anyone if they need to rearm, right? That's a big problem for the civilian guys who are also using tungsten, because although, we kind of associate it historically, it's been used for tungsten carbides or steels. So think about, heavy duty drilling bits for the oil and gas industry or or mines, right? But it's actually, another one of these wonder spice drugs is finding ever more applications in new technology, right? So at the moment, there's not enough. If everyone wants to try and restock, whether civilian or military, and that's what the price is telling you, right? It's kind of this is kind of a metal that's in real scarcity, and particularly then in that context, you look at the mineral sink that is going on, as it were, in the Gulf hostilities. Yeah, there's a big problem building here, and I would expect. Normally, in these things, the military will get preference over everyone else. So some of the new mines that will be brought on will give their offtake primary first and foremost to the Department of Defense or Department of War now. But someone gets squeezed in that, in that equation, right? I mean, so you're a civilian buyer, you might be facing some very, very tough. I was going to say tough prices. It may not even be a question of price. It may just be a question of can you get it?
Andy, this is exactly where I wanted to go, which is, are we approaching a paradigm shift here of sorts, in the sense that traditionally, as they always say, the cure for high prices is high prices. Okay, the price of tungsten goes to the moon, and therefore there will be demand destruction, and then tungsten comes on the market, and then we start to replenish supplies as capitalism does its game. But it seems to me, if we just look at the variables that you've presented to us here, we have the military coming in, and it seems to me they're going to pay whatever they have to pay to get their Patriot missiles. They're not going to be cheaping out on, okay, we can't get our tungsten. So it seems to me we run into the potential issue of actually running out of this stuff, and that the market potentially might not work. I mean, what do you think of that?
I think you're spot on. So again, let's go back to the halcyon days of 10 years ago, or maybe didn't feel that way. Look, market economics was such that absolutely the price goes up, more production comes on to feed that price, right? And all demand gets trimmed back. But the problem is, where was that production going to come from, right? China's got the big swing capacity in all these niche metals, right? China could easily pump up the volumes of tungsten, but not with the Ministry of Customs guarding the gate there, because, you can't export it anymore. And you certainly, you can export it, but the licensing restrictions are now very tight. And as far as the Chinese authorities are concerned, if that tungsten there is going anywhere near the US military, just forget it, right? That you're not going to get an export license. So that classic market response assumes a global market that functions as a global market, right? But in the mineral space, we stopped working that way some time ago, right? Because quite clearly when China restricts exports, that's not a market mechanism, right? So to get the metals, we have to do it ourselves in the West. We cannot, obviously, we realize we're not going to get any more from China. And China was going to use more of its own rare materials. Anyways, its high-tech capacities expand. So we have to build mines. We have to build processing plants. And look, the West is not, naive about this. Sort of the US administration, not just this one, but the previous one, the one before that, have been channeling money into the critical minerals world, right? And yeah, great. That's just one issue. The European Union is sort of doing the same, but it's always a little bit more chaotic in terms of its policy making decision in the European Union, and it tends to sort of run a bit behind wherever the United States is, right? But it takes time, right? The US hasn't had a tungsten mine for years, right? So let's start a specialty niche supply chain from scratch for mining it, processing it, making it into product that then we actually use. And by the way, we're not doing this just for tungsten. We're doing this with all critical metals now, right? And I'll just remind you, United States Geological Survey now identifies 60 metals that are deemed to be critical, right, for US national defense, right? Now, some of them more critical than others. So, but what we're trying to do in tungsten, we're trying to do with the rare earths, we're trying to do in gallium, we're trying to do in germanium, all at the same time, right? So at some stage, this will all pay off. But anyone who's in the mining business will say, hey, it's all way one thing to sort of like, you can put this down on paper, but it takes a little while before you can start actually producing metal out of the ground and sort of like getting stuff out of the ground and then having that processing capacity to turn it from basically a bunch of rock to something that we put into sort of like, an F-35, fighter jet, right? That needs a whole supply chain, processing chain to be evolved around it. It cannot be done overnight. And in the interim, we have a bit of a crunch, right? And I think you could say the same for germanium, subject to Chinese export restrictions. You could say the same for, gallium. You could say the same for rare earths, right? And you're seeing extreme price pressure because of this at the moment. We're in the gap period, right? We haven't built up enough of our own stuff. China is leveraging its position. So they'll say, we're allowing exports. Not to the same extent you did, certainly, right? And therefore the West has to sort of like fill out that gap if it's going to sort of like run out of these metals. So you're right. I think that's what's changed. A globally efficient market dynamic assumes there is a global market. We don't have that global market anymore. We have a fractured market.
Fascinating. And as we wrap up here, Andy, you've been following these markets for decades. We have this issue in the Strait of Hormuz. Big picture, like what's on your mind right now? What are you looking at? Where's your focus right now?
Unfortunately, across 60 metals and minerals as they to be critical. But I think one of the big themes, and we haven't touched on this yet, but it is really relevant to everyone really, is what's changed in these metal markets, right? So I've been through boom and bust cycles before, right? There has always been investment participation in industrial metals. What's changed, though, is the nature of that investment participation. So what was previously, industrial metals, a bit of a niche area, right? It's only really the bigger funds, the more sophisticated players would play around in these markets, right? This wasn't really for the man in the street. This wasn't gold or silver. That's changed. So, you just go back, a couple of months, it's what I call the metals madness that was playing out, both gold, silver, but also in the industrial metals, right? That is being driven by a new generation of retail investor. Yeah? Why? Why have they turned up? Because of the stuff we're talking about. Because you don't have to be on the moon to understand that, we are entering a new metals age. It is the new oil, to some extent. So they're all important. Everything has its own story. So it's gone onto that investment radar, so-called the man or the woman in the street, in a way that I think wasn't the case historically. And that applies both, by the way, in China, which, if anything, has a slightly longer track record of retail investment in these markets, but it increasingly applies to Western investors as well. And I think, sort of one of my little, themes, if you like, is what I call the internet metals. So silver is an internet metal. What I mean, because it's used in circuit boards, sort of wiring and all that, right? And silver has its own great history of retail participation, but it's not the only one, right? So copper is very much an internet sort of metal, right? Data centers, wiring, everything. Tin's one as well. It's the solder and circuit boards. So these kind of are new investment themes that have evolved as people understand better the role the metals will play, not just in decarbonization, but in the coming Internet of Things, right? And because we live in a social media age, investment themes become investment memes. Right. So suddenly, you go onto you go onto Reddit or you go to WeChat in China, you'll find lots of like-minded individual investors playing the same markets as you, exchanging ideas, right? This is what's changed. As metals have become mainstream again, no big surprise that the man in the street and the woman in the streets kind of think, well, actually, maybe, I've always maybe had a bit of a punt on gold and silver. Maybe I should do on tin now. Right. But these are quite finite specialist markets, but not necessarily well structured to deal with big flows of speculative money coming in and out in that way. Now, I think you saw some of the extreme volatility of January across all the metal space was down to what I call that retail investment crowd coming in. Right. And, if you look, for example, in copper, it's really interesting. So the funds in copper can play on the London Metal Exchange or on the CME exchange in the United States. And people like me spend a lot of time tracking those positions through commitments or traders reports, right? So you go back to the all-time highs of copper in January, and I look at the COTR for CME copper, not very much to see there. which is strange, right? But then look at some of their newer contracts. Look at the micro contract, the micro copper contract, right? 10th of the size of the main one. It traded over 1 million tons equivalent in January alone. That's the man in the street en masse coming into the markets, right? There's huge volumes are coming in through these new channels into what has historically, I guess, been, we always used to say, these are not markets for widows and orphans, but they are now.
Okay, final just follow up on that, Andy, since you mentioned it, it is quite fascinating. I mean, the volumes we were seeing in January in China, I think the Shanghai metals market and maybe the Guangzhou futures exchange, they're pretty head-turning numbers. So is that what's going on there? Is that just, Chinese retail?
No, I think they were a little bit ahead of the game here, and partly because I think culturally, I mean, obviously China has been the big metal story this century, in a way they say Britain was in the 19th century when the London Metal Exchange all that set up. So they're much closer to that reality of being a huge metals buyer than we have probably been in the West for some time. Secondly, where do you put your money in China? Where does household wealth get invested? Well, historically, it was always in the property market. Not looking such a great bet since 2016, really, when we had a sort of gradual meltdown of property there, right? So, I'm old enough to remember these guys were punting stuff. There was the great ferrosilicon squeeze of about 7 or 8 years ago. Who knows where even missiles guys don't spend a lot of time thinking about ferrosilicon, but you kind of saw there was just a retail surge. The word went out on WeChat, guys, you want to make some money, come in here, right? Now, bear in mind, a lot of these retail investors, right, as long as I kind of basically keep to intraday trading, my entry margin is virtually zero. If I leave my position overnight, then I'm going to have to pay more margin. So these guys are coming in and out all the time, right? And that's where you see that huge volumes come from. I mean, it's always worth doing a comparison volume to open interest, right? I mean, volumes are massive. Open interest is often quite small in Chinese. That is, again, the army of Chinese retail investors getting involved. As I said, I think what's changed is kind of like the West is almost kind of caught that same metals fever. And I think what you saw in January, the Chinese exchanges were going particularly nuts, if you like. But then look at the volatility in silver, look at the volatility in copper. We were as well, right? And that's the big change. This is a mainstream story now. And, it's Main Street, not just Wall Street, that's investing in these specialist sort of commodity markets.
Absolutely fascinating. And we could just keep going here. Andy Home, senior metals columnist at Reuters, thank you for joining us and sharing all of your wisdom with us on this week's Northern Miner podcast.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pleasure to have a chat with you.
I hope you enjoyed that extended interview with Andy Home. Again, big thank you to Andy Home over at Reuters for joining us on this week's episode. And thank you, dear listener, for continuing to support this program. If you want to help out the podcast, please leave us a review in the Apple Podcast directory. Share it with your friends. And until next week, take care.